So welcome everybody to our Knowledge and Networking breakfast webinar in Advances in Medical Technology. Before we get started, I would like to recognize today that the land we're standing on is in the traditional territory of the many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Nishabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and it is now also home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. I also want to acknowledge that Ontario is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, which was signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. And I would ask that wherever you're sitting today or standing today, that you think about where you're standing as we live and learn along the path of reconciliation together. Before we get started, I'd just like a couple of housekeeping notes. So we have set it up so you're as guests or as attendees that your mics are not on and your video is not on. But if you want to follow along in closed captioning, you can do so by clicking on the CC button, the closed caption button on the bottom right hand of your screen. Well, that's where it is on my screen. I'm not sure where it is on everybody's screen, but that's where you can find it. And I'd also like to say, if you want to ask questions, and we do encourage you to ask questions, please do. Please put them in the Q&A. So we're not going to do live questions. So if you raise your hand, I won't see it. So please put it in the Q&A section, and then I will moderate your questions as we go along. If you have any technical difficulties, you can get a hold of, in the chat function, you can get a hold of someone from the LSO office and they can help you out. So today I'd like to welcome our three speakers, David, Ken, and Zayna. I think it's going to be a really fascinating talk. I'm going to introduce them as we go along. So first I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, who is David Stewart, who's the Director of Management Consulting and the Life Science Senior Analyst at RSM. He's responsible for supporting local and cross-border transactions, managing and leading mergers and acquisitions, and supporting strategic advisory services in the private and public company sectors. And specifically of interest us today, he was selected just recently as a senior analyst in a cutting-edge industry eminence program at RSM, which positions senior analysts to understand, forecast, and communicate the economic, business, and technology trends within certain industries that RSM serves. And in this role, David's focus is on the life science industry. He personally is based in San Francisco, so we want to say thank you very much to David for getting up a little early for us this morning. And I'll hand it to you. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Alison. I appreciate the warm welcome, and it's certainly excited to be here. Just want to make sure everyone can see my screen okay?
Yes, that's good.
Perfect. So as you can hear, I'm originally born and raised in Canada. I still have a thick Canadian accent. I just recently moved to the Bay Area. So behind me, you'll see the sun setting here in the morning or rising. I mean, but born and raised in Barrie, Ontario. I've got a bit of a different background, not a technical background. I started my career at GE Capital in their corporate finance division. So my expertise and experiences in the once the hard part, the technical part has been solved, and I always call it the very difficult parts, then I move and support companies on the commercialization, the scaling commercialization, and kind of navigating the investor landscape. So with that, I'll dive into my presentation today. It's going to be kind of focused on four big sectors. First, capital markets, so a broad overview of kind of what's transpired in the last couple of years, with some narrative around kind of the bigger picture, the last 10 to 15 years, what's happening in the economy. Then what does that mean into the private sector? So looking at the venture capital and in private equity investment space. And then the final two sections would be kind of a quick snapshot on what challenges a lot of companies are currently facing, and I'm sure everyone here has felt this on the labor front. And then finally, we're taking a deep dive. I focus specifically on the health tech, kind of med tech space. So looking at the investment over the last couple of years and in terms of the dollars going into that space. And all my slides today are kind of looking at the North American capital market or North American market. So we do look at the Canadian market, but it's heavily influenced by what's happening south of the border and where I am particularly. So I continue to work cross-border with a lot of Canadian and US companies because it seems like whatever happens in the US always seems to spill over into Canada as well. So with that, just a quick overview on RSM. So RSM is a full service accounting, audit, and consulting firm. As Allison mentioned, I focus on the consulting side. So I kind of work cross-functional across with our audit and tax folks as well, depending on when they are needed. So first, the capital markets. I always find this slide very interesting. This is kind of really to set the stage on what's happened since the pandemic. And I wish I had the space. I would kind of showcase the last 10 years as well. Is that we have to remember, you know, the last 10 years has been a very frothy time overall from an economic standpoint. So the amount of liquidity, capital, and
David, sorry to interrupt. We don't see the next slide.
Do you see anything there?
We still see your first slide. Apologize for interrupting.
Oh, no worries. Allison, could you mind, sorry, Teams, or would you be able to bring that up? I sent the presentation over to Brian. Perhaps that might be a little easier.
Sure, Brian, could you do that for us? Perfect.
There we go. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let me start over there a little bit. So I love this slide. Like I mentioned, I wish I could show the previous 10 years because from an economic standpoint, we've had one of the largest bull markets prior to the pandemic. So if you look at the period from 2010 all the way up to almost, you know, early 2019 when the pandemic happened, overall the S&P 500 has risen sharply. And then we had a quick reset. You can see, you know, we benchmarked this on the S&P 500, so that's the red line there. But you can see, you know, there was a quick temporary kind of blip when you know there was a lot of uncertainty when the first closures happened. But you know, from what we saw from a government fiscal monetary policy, it was extremely supportive. So there was a lot of capital being driven back into the economy to support kind of growth. So that money had to go somewhere, and it certainly went to the rising equity values that we've seen in the last couple of years. So now as we navigate forward, there's a lot of, you can probably see a ton of headlines. And one of the famous lines we always like to say is that, you know, remember the market is not the economy. So you'll see, you know, and what we expect to see is as the Fed, you know, continues to tighten fiscal and monetary policy, there'll be increased volatility in terms of what that means, the digestion of that into the economy. And I always kind of level set that, you know, the economy does not always, you know, perfectly predict investment. So a lot of it is driven by behavioral, you know, sentiment on what is going to happen in the next year or two, not kind of a long-term, you know, opportunity. So again, this is just a very interesting slide because we saw a very strong convergence at the beginning of the pandemic, a very sharp rise in the value of you know, the life science tools and services, some of the assets that could win quick returns, but there was a very slow kind of digestion on the biotech and pharma side. So I always find this slide extremely interesting just to kind of set the stage. Brian, if you can move ahead one slide. And so what does that mean to, you know, on the private sector side? So, or even first backing up here on the IPO side. So the public capital markets has been, you know, oversaturated with a lot of deals in the last 2 years. So given the frothy economy that we've had, a lot of companies have, you know, have accelerated their time to IPO. Valuations are high, so they took advantage of that opportunity. And you know, if you look back in the last 2 years, the averages are, you know, well above historic norms. And despite the recent fall off, we're still kind of remaining at that high level. Now, expectations for the year ahead as, again, the economy continues to digest the Fed and the tightening of the Fed and monetary and fiscal policy is that there obviously be a bit of a resetting or at least a normalization kind of going forward. So just want to set that stage that, you know, we expect that trend to continue. The sky isn't falling. You know, we're not going to go into a complete collapse. We're really just kind of normalizing or getting back to historical norms, which I think overall is going to be good for the economy. So just kind of want to level set that. Brian, if you can move ahead to the next one. So this is the slide, and this is the area that we focus on quite a bit because we're heavily focused on the private sector. So this is the P and VC space. There has, given the high valuation marks that have occurred in the last 10 years, that has driven a lot of capital allocation into private equity and venture capital. So fundraising at the fund level has been historically high. There's a lot of dry powder, and a lot of that has been deployed into the economy. Now, what we're seeing is, given that valuations have dropped fairly significantly, or even just a quick reset, is that private equity and venture capital firms have really tightened their belt. So that we saw a very tight kind of fall off, or a quick fall off late in March of this year that you can see in that graph. But again, averages are still very strong. We expect that trend to continue and get to a normalized stage, but dry powder remains extremely strong. So despite kind of what we expect in the next 6 to 12 months to be a tightening window, there is still lots of capital out there. And as the economy kind of, the private and public markets digest what is occurring, we expect to see some of that dry powder get redeployed. But in the short term, there will certainly be kind of some, there'll be a tightening of deal terms. So if you haven't raised capital yet, just expect a longer funding process or a longer time to get that capital, and there'll be tightening deal conditions. The last 12 years has been a very favorable time for companies to commercialize or go public, or even raise capital in the private sector. So we're going to kind of return back to historical norms, and overall will be kind of a good thing for the economy. If we can move ahead another slide. So this is the third section I wanted to cover, which was the labor and employment. If we move ahead one more, I really like this slide because we normalized from almost 2015, kind of the divergence of labor and the demand. So if you look at the top two, you can see those are specialized services, or the demand for the growth cycle in the specialized services, and they've completely accelerated from, or almost decoupled from, kind of the traditional healthcare non-specialized services, and growth has been kind of turbocharged. So it's probably all of you guys have experienced is there's an extreme shortage of specialized skills in the economy, and outsourcing demands continue to rise, and it's a challenge that there isn't a quick solution to, unfortunately. So more capital, more resources need to be funneled into helping drive education and helping drive the specialized skills that are needed. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good news on that front. It's not it's unfortunately not going to be a quick problem that's going to be solved. We've seen a very strong decoupling. It hasn't reset at all in the last couple of years. So we're watching this trend closely, but it needs to a lot more effort needs to be focused on this space. And if we move ahead to the last one here. And one more. So I love this slide. So despite kind of all the volatility in the markets, and we've seen the quick drop off in the venture capital deployment, one area that has remained extremely strong and kind of teeing up for the rest of the presentation you'll see, or the presentations you'll see, is the health tech space. So this goes back just to 2017, but even prior to that, there was no significant spike. So this is just looking at the amount of capital invested in the health tech space, and it does cover a broad sector of companies, but you can see very significant growth over the last 2 years, and even median valuations rising very significantly with not much of a fall off. I expect the next 6 months as again, the economy continues to digest the tightening fiscal and monetary policy, that perhaps there may be a small reset in the valuations or the valuations, but the amount of capital being deployed into this sector has been very robust, and a lot driven by a lot of different factors. But most significantly is investors are looking for kind of quick wins, or at least quick commercializations. And a lot of the technology has been proven that it's ready for prime time. It's ready to be deployed. The direct-to-consumer model has been proven kind of over and over again now, and it's continuing to support a lot of the capital that has been driven to this sector. So with that, I think I'll end the presentation, and want to leave a few minutes for any questions that have come up, and then turn it over.
Thank you very much, David. And I remind people to put questions in the Q&A session. But so can you just talk a little bit more about that? Because in terms of investment, so typically life science, maybe not the health tech, and so maybe it's a difference between health tech and therapeutic side. You know, people have been a bit risk averse for putting money in. Do you think, given maybe the pandemic, or given how people have viewed life science in the last little while, that's one of the shifts in terms of valuations? That's question one. And question two, is that also a reason for downturn? Because people wanted to invest in all this stuff to do with COVID, and now COVID's not gone, I will say. But in terms of investment into the technology, perhaps it's not at the same level. So do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start with kind of investors don't always get it right, or they're a large piece that is driving kind of what where investors make decision is return on investment, or the return on capital. So unfortunately, we would love to deploy capital kind of in areas that have longer tails, but it's difficult because the models start to break down when it takes 5 to 10 years to commercialize a product. So just on that aspect, valuations from what we've seen on the biotech or pharma side, given that those areas, especially in the early stage, take much longer to commercialize and to achieve profitability, they've been, especially in the last 2 years, they've diverged a little bit. So the valuations have been significantly lower. It's starting to normalize a little bit, but where most of the capital has been deployed is on the services side, where there's quick wins, where there's the ability to commercialize products quickly. So what I would say is that the last 2 years overall, though, has been relatively frothy. So it has been a good time to raise capital, relatively speaking. What happens in the next 12 months? I think there's 6 to 12 months as the economy as a whole digests what's kind of occurring with the rising rate hikes, the tightening monetary policy. Is that valuations will continue to kind of retreat a little bit, or at least normalize, and we'll have some choppy waters kind of ahead. So not sure if I covered that question.
Yeah,
but
that's good. Thank you. One of the questions just provided was, can you speak to where companies are sourcing their financing, banks, private debt, and if that's changed in recent times? Do you see a balance changing where people are looking for their money?
Yeah, so the last, in the last 5 years, I would say is that we've seen very significant, asset allocations to the private sector has risen quite sharply. So a lot of the money from, hedge funds, from the large players that have lots of pools of capital, their allocation to private equity and venture capital has increased. So that's driven, large funding rounds. You've seen massive growth in venture capital. So a lot more money now is being raised kind of in the early stages in the privatized sector, in the venture capital and private equity space. And then, couple that a lot of money has driven then into private funding as well. So we've seen a very strong growth in the private funding sector that has funded early stages, which is great for the economy, because we even great for the industry. We need to continue to support that. We don't see that changing anytime soon. The returns have been very robust in the last 10 years. So we expect that trend will continue.
Right. And maybe one last question. Do you see a difference in respect to access to capital in Ontario, or even Canada broadly, compared to San Fran, or the States in general?
Yeah, and I'll just answer that, because I've worked the last 2 years now with a lot of companies kind of on both sides of the border. And the one thing I always say is that, especially people in the US, they're really just looking for great opportunities. And continuously, what I hear from a lot of investors is that if there was a good opportunity in Canada, they would love to. Canada is a very friendly place to invest dollars. They're always looking to deploy it. So the demand is certainly growing. I think there's a bit of a lagging effect, because the economy, or the industry, has been very strong and robust for the last couple of years. So what we've seen is that most of that capital has just been deployed in the US. But now, as kind of things begin to tighten, I expect that it'll be very favorable for Canada in the next year or two. A lot of that people who haven't looked north of the border will begin to do so.
Okay, that's good news. Thanks, David. And if you have more questions for David, I think we can continue on afterwards, or you can certainly get a hold of him through RSM. So I'd like to introduce Ken now, Ken Hughes, who's the Chief Operating Officer for Microbix. And he's been around the biotechnology and biopharmaceutical industries for quite a while in Ontario. He's really well known, a good friend. He's previously been President and CEO of or VP of Scientific Affairs for a variety of different groups, including private companies, Innovative Medicines Canada, which is our industry association, one of the industry associations for life sciences, co-founder and advisory board member of Platform Corporation, so a variety of things. And he's here to tell us about Microbix. So Ken, I'll pass it to you.
Okay. Thank you, Alison. Yes, I am indeed very old and have been around for a while. I hope everybody can see my slides, and I hope I have more luck than David in advancing them. So yeah, my name's Ken Hughes. I'm a scientist by training, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Microbix. As this is a medtech session, and we're a biotech medtech company, I thought I'd give a little introduction to Microbix. I think it's fair enough to say that we remain somewhat of a lesser known company in this space, although our profile has been increasing recently. After I've done that, I'll briefly touch on topically what we've been doing in COVID-19 pandemic response, and then finish with a quick discussion on where the market segment we're involved in could and should go as we go from pandemic into endemic, to make sure the capabilities that have been developed are indeed deployed. So Microbix today, we are an innovative, publicly traded biotech medtech company based in Mississauga, Ontario. We're substantially historically being a exporter, although we sell a lot more in Ontario these days, and we're in a process of rapid growth. We did over 18 million last year, and we're profitable, and we expect to grow rapidly from there. In the medtech space, we're a global leader in supplying of native antigens, the so-called Intel Inside, for serological testing for infectious disease diagnostics throughout the globe. We are also using those skills in virology, a provider of what we call quality assessment products, which are basically positive and negative controls to ensure the accuracy of all forms of molecular and antigen-based testing for infectious diseases. Something we've got involved in recently has been preparing viral transport medium, and I'll talk a little bit about that for COVID-19 testing and for other pathogen testing on a go-forward basis. This was supported by the Government of Ontario, and we started delivering that material in 2021 and continue to this very day. So we're primed in multiple areas in medtech for sales growth and share price appreciation. We do have a pharma product as well, but I'm going to focus on the medtech side today, which is basically our knitting. So as I said, we have three basic business units in biotech medtech. We are the global, I think we are the global leader in native diagnostic antigen production for infectious disease testing. We support over 100 global manufacturers of these kits and have over 30 products in this area. Until recently, we were a major exporter out of Canada with 95% overseas, and we're poised for future growth as enhanced capabilities are redeployed. Examples would be, and this is germane to what I'm going to get to, we've been producing flu A and flu B respiratory antigens for many, many years, and respiratory syncytial virus, RSV. We're also involved in things like pediatric diseases, sexually transmitted infections like herpes or hepatitis, or childhood infections like Epstein-Barr virus, and some non-viral pathogens like chlamydia. We also have mycoplasma and things of that nature. We've diversified from there into what we call quality assessment products. There are three areas they're involved with, but that's really about assuring proficiency of laboratories in supplying accurate results in testing. So when they're testing a portfolio of patient specimens, start with a validated medical device, positive and negative control, end with a session with a positive and negative control, and all the samples in between are more likely to be correct, in fact, are indeed validated. And as previously said, where we have a program in viral transport medium, which is the three legs of the stool of our core medtech business. We've done a lot of growth in the last 3 years, going back to before the pandemic. We have over 100 staff now on 34,000 square feet. We have the necessary regulatory accreditations you would expect. 3 years ago, we had one building, building 1, which is where the antigens are produced and where we have a BSL-2 plus containment facility for growing viruses, purifying them, inactivating them, and creating products from them, which we actually sell. It makes us a little bit of a unicorn in biotech these days. We're actually putting a CSL3 facility in there right now. We have in the last couple of years, we've built out a second building, also on Watline Avenue in Mississauga, where we produce our caps products, both liquid and swabs based, and I'll give you a little bit more detail on that. And we've just recently completed the build out of a third facility where we're going to produce high volume viral transport media, not only to support Ontario, but the balance of Canada and the rest of the world as we go forward on a growth trajectory. As I say, we're a little unusual, I think, in the biotech, medtech space, the innovative space at least. We're highly competent and innovative in science. A lot of virologists, a lot of molecular virologists and biologists, a lot of proteomics experts, but we also have manufacturing capability at high scale and the necessary quality management systems to allow us to produce products. And not only that, do we sell them globally, and obviously we make profits in that regard, and we reinvest them into our continued growth, which is basically taking off right now. And it's been very good to see. The current platforms enable accelerated growth. So let me talk a little bit. I've talked about antigens. I think it's obvious what they are. They're the intel inside of serological tests globally. Let's talk about quality assessment products a little bit, because it's germane to where I'm going to go with COVID-19. So proper quality control assures the accuracy of tests. So if you run the necessary controls, and I'm not talking about the PCR test, a glorified oligo which shows the PCR reaction is working. I'm talking about something which looks like a patient specimen. So extraction, technician training and execution, the machinery working correctly, the data handling working correctly is all challenged by something which effectively looks like a patient specimen. This requirement really applies to immunoassay and nucleotide testing in Europe and the US. They recommend third-party quality controls, and that's a space that we got into. And based on our scientific expertise in growing viruses, inactivating them, manipulating them, formulating them, stabilize them to look like patient specimens. This is a good place for us to get into, all supported, of course, by validation and the quality management system we have at Microbix. So well suited to pursue this line. We started on things like human papillomavirus in 2018, 2019. We were just about to launch a major molecular testing control program in Italy before the pandemic. But of course, every PCR machine in the world, when the pandemic started testing for COVID-19, so that got a bit on hold. And also we were working for controls for flu testing, which is germane to where I'm just about to go. I talked about proficiency testing, make sure labs are accredited. So we provide white label, blinded samples of different viruses on swabs or in liquid form, where labs are provided with these materials and told, tell us which is which and get it right, otherwise you're going to lose your accreditation. Of course, if they get it right, they get their accreditation 3 times a year and you can continue. But we also now have medical device products for our Proceed brand, which is applied to OEMs who manufacture kits for inbounding machinery, for training and for validation. And we have medical device red controls, which are sold to clinical laboratories themselves to augment and ensure the maximum accuracy of their workflow. And you can see in the 2 panels there, you can see the swabs there, where in the Proceed RUO product, we have red in the same form, where on the tip, of course, you have multiple viruses inactivated, which are used as positive control, or human tissues without viruses, negative controls, and we have liquid forms as well. And that business is growing, as you could expect, very rapidly. This is all very good in terms of control, but what about COVID-19? So we're working on HPV, we're working on flu, we're experts in respiratory diseases. So naturally, we pivoted in 2020 to get involved in the COVID-19 and ensure the maximum accuracy of COVID-19 testing. And because of our intellectual property, we have patents in this space, we have expert scientists in this space, we've been able to develop a whole portfolio of products. And here's the list, at least an incomplete list, and you can see we have positive control swabs for testing for wild type original SARS-CoV-2 to the virus which causes COVID-19. We also have antigen swabs for protein tests as well. We have swab controls, full genome swab controls, by the way, so they work on all molecular platforms for all variants of control, including Omicron. And we've got to the level now where we're doing multiplex swabs. And I've given an example here of a respiratory panel involving SARS-CoV-2, germane to flu A and flu B and RSV, so you can discriminate between the infectious diseases somebody might have. And of course, we have positive and negative controls, both in swab form and in liquid form. The medical devices for clinical laboratory testing under the RED brand, and RUO for training and installation under the Proceed brand. And we're currently selling these products worldwide. Staying on the pandemic front, I want to talk a little bit about viral transport medium. As I said, we're not only a innovative development group, we're a manufacturing group, and we produce large-scale production media in-house for our own viral culture procedure. So it was a natural fit when we recognized supply chain issues with COVID-19, including getting viral transport medium in to allow testing to proceed in Canada, was a need that we could service. And so we reached out, or actually they reached out to us, to the Ministry of Economic Development. And after some negotiation, we got a $1.45 million grant from the Ontario Together Fund to develop what we call Dxtm brand viral transport medium to service initially Ontario and then Canada and beyond from there. And of course, what viral transport medium does is when you take the swab and you break it off and you put it in the tube. And here's an example right in my hand of a Microbix's product. That's what stabilizes the product to allow that swab to be shipped to the lab for PCR or antigen testing on a go-forward basis. And now, after we've supplied literally millions of doses to Ontario, we are perceived as and correctly as a preferred domestic supplier, because some of the imported stuff was of questionable quality if it was available at all. So speaking to supply chain and the need to do things in Ontario. Right now, there's 20,000 tests in Ontario being done every day. And as I said, we're a preferred supplier to this. In building 3 of our build out, we're currently producing 50,000 a week. Actually, it's 100,000 a week in double shifting. And we're going to go to 50,000 a day as we execute full automation. So this is a large healthcare opportunity and a large value opportunity for Microbix. Health and health economic realities are clear. So that's all lovely. That's COVID-19. Shows how we've benefited from that and what Microbix has done. We've been involved in that since 2020, as you'd expect. So what's the next steps? What are we going to do? So the health economics of doing infectious disease diagnostic testing correctly should now be clear to everyone. Anybody, it's not understanding where we are today because of the dangers of infectious diseases has been asleep at the switch. But COVID-19 is going to go from pandemic to endemic. There's a whole load of capacity to be deployed. So what are you going to do down the line from there? Obviously, you're going to need viral transport media to get samples around. Self-collection is a big factor going forward. But molecular testing capacity could and should be redeployed. If it isn't, people are asleep at the switch. Next diagnostics up, human papillomavirus for early screening of multiple cancers, including cervical cancers, other sexually transmitted diseases, other respiratory infections. If you haven't got COVID-19, do you have flu? What do you have? Gastrointestinal infections, hospital-acquired infections, and very key antimicrobial resistance pathogens should be tested for to keep people safe and preserve health and cut it off at the pass before it gets more expensive. It's both a health and a health economic benefit. And I guess everybody would be unsurprised to learn, based on our history in virology, that we've been developing controls and products in this space for multiple years before the pandemic, and we'll roll out the human papillomavirus program, where we have benign and malignant forms of this on controls as we move forward. So what we should be seeing, and I hope that will be the case, is an understanding of the accuracy of infectious disease testing is a positive aspect of value for society, and we should be entering a new golden age of diagnostics as we move forward. And if we do that, I think we're going to be in a much better place going forward, because the capacity there is to be deployed. And Microbix can participate in that, not in Canada, in North America, and globally. So there you go. That's my little introduction to Microbix, and I think the reality of the day, Jermaine, to COVID-19. And I'll stop there for questions. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Ken, and a reminder to put your questions in the chat. So just one of the things that David brought up was lack of labor, and you've grown quite significantly, and 2 new buildings and all of. So have you had issues? Where do you source most of your labor from, or can you speak to that part for your business? That's a
really interesting question. I mean, we've had to. There is a labor shortage, and people are wanting to be paid. So, you know, you look at that type of thing as well. We don't seem to have problems attracting talent. I think we're a pretty interesting company, and people come in the door and they like us and they want to work for us. What we do have a problem with is keeping the talent, because we're based in Mississauga, and we're accountable to our shareholders, where there are certain groups on University Avenue who are not, and can parasitize real companies. And so that's something that we have a little bit of a problem with. But really, I mean, yes, there is a difficulty in acquiring talent, but it's not so bad. It's managing the churn, which we see to be we see to be the problem. And I think a little bit more accountability at certain quarters might deal with that as well. There is a lot of Canadian talent. We hear a lot about there's not a lot of Canadian talent. That's just not true. There's a lot of Canadian talent. People just don't necessarily want to look for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So have you seen a change? So you've been around not for that long. I wouldn't mean to make you sound bad. but the Microbix has been around for quite a while too, and obviously has found its niche and is expanding and all of those things. I guess this is a 2-point thing. Have you really seen a difference in the life science ecosystem over the last few years? Obviously, you guys kind of jumped on and saw an opportunity for yourself, but how important was that Ontario procurement piece to validating what you're doing and getting that piece going?
Well, I did shout out to the Ontario Together Fund, and the Ministry of Economic Development has been very supportive. And I should also shout out to FedDev Ontario, because before the pandemic, when we were growing the business, automating through bioreactor culture or rubella virus programs, which are, you know, we're the global leader in that, and they supported us there as well. Do I believe that there's a more interest in medtech and infectious disease medtech specifically? Yes, I think it's certainly germane to the Canadian ecosystem. Maybe there's a little bit of a move away from throwing Hail Marys to cure cancer. I mean, that's all good. But this is a stable business which grows in, you know, linear to log way, rather than just, you know, have that discontinuity or acquisition at phase 2. We actually, you know, sell products and make profits with selling products. Right. So the marketplace has changed a little bit, and I hope we're driving that right. way. We have to, in Canada, I think, move away necessarily from you know, being the discovery hub to be perhaps the development and the deployment hub, and have some work in that regard. And I think, you know, the delivery hub, if you like, you know, so you have a discovery district, right. Why not have a delivery district? And if we move in that direction, I think they'll be strong. And like, I mean, I think, I don't want to speak for anybody, but, you know, if it makes business sense and you can articulate the value proposition, it doesn't really matter where you are, right? Right. And I think the value proposition in the industry we're in, unless you're blind, you know, and haven't been paying attention for the last 2 years, right. The value proposition is pretty clear right now. Yeah. And the capabilities to deploy beyond that into things like cervical cancer testing, you know, because, you know, you can, molecular testing will bring the risk profile delineation like several years ahead. You're going to stop people dying, and that's health economic as well as health. So it's morally correct and economically correct to do that.
Right. Yeah. And maybe one more question, Ken, just because of our time. Somebody's asking that the testing volumes, and I assume we're talking here about COVID, because perhaps testing volumes for other things will increase, but the testing volumes have decreased quite significantly. Obviously, we've talked about that. So is that going to affect the company in terms of what your plan is in that space? Well,
we're not just, people foolishly assume that we're a COVID play. I mean, we were a growing business before COVID happened, and that's why it was very important to shout out to FedDev, who was supporting us long before COVID and recognizing what we were doing. So, you know, we're currently selling our VTM, Dxtm into Ontario, and they've snafu'd the lion's share of that. but we're building capacity. And last time I looked, there's several other provinces and territories in Canada, and there are global markets too. And so and that's just if you consider COVID-19, but obviously all the other testing that should be done down the line is going to require these types of products and excellence in the quality management system, so that all medical devices. So to answer the question directly, everything affects us, but we have a multifactorial opportunity, both in terms of markets we can enter and SKUs that we can develop and deploy. So I think when we go endemic on COVID-19, the need to test for a million other things that haven't been tested for remains, and that's really the opportunity for Microbix going forward.
Great, thanks, Ken. There is a question, I'll hopefully come back to this question. It's about labor costs and whether or not we can throw money at part of that problem. But we'll come back to that question at the end if we have time, but I do want to make sure we get to Zayna. So thank you very much, Ken. It's a great Canadian success story. So thank you for that.
No worries, thank you very much.
And I'd like to introduce Zayna Khayat, who's the VP of Client Success and Growth from Teledoc Health. Zayna has previously led the Futures team with the National Home Healthcare and Aging Not-for-Profit. She is on faculty of Singularity University, the Exponential Medicine stream, an adjunct faculty to Health Sector Strategy stream. She's a busy lady and has been a voice within the innovation system in Ontario and Toronto for an important voice for all of us. And so I'm going to pass it over to Zayna to talk about what current company is working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Hello, everyone. Nice to see some colleagues and the participants. And I was a PhD student at U of T in the 90s, and I used to go to these breakfasts. And they're the reason I ended up kind of ditching academia and heading to Bay Street, and that's kind of where my career took off. So it's just so thrilling to kind of come back and back when I was pipetting cells and looking at sacrificing mice, I never would have dreamed I'd be able to have this conversation I'm about to have today. So look, here's your takeaway when you go back to work and people are like, what did you do this morning? You've learned a new word. You can choose from either the word digital or phygital. And that's because, the world is now a digital world that, came from an industrial era of physical assets. And so, you look at these major industries where the dominant player from an extremely asset intensive industry, whether that's taxis or hotels or media or retail like Alibaba, kind of came up pretty quickly and became the dominant player because the value is created by aggregating the assets and getting value out of the assets versus kind of manufacturing and getting them to people. And so, in my MBA class that I teach on health innovation, I always start with this question, who is this going to be for healthcare? And because there will be, it might not be, for the whole world, but I think each country will have one. And I've got my guest for Canada. Maybe you guys can throw something in the chat. And so why is this, and this is where digital or physical comes in is, the industrial era of all of our society and wow, was healthcare industrialized, was about the left, right? And so if you think 150 years of medicine was building assets that are very, very capital intensive, labor intensive, asset intensive, and extremely static. And healthcare is anything but static. It's the most dynamic thing there is. It's dynamic in the individual body, dynamic in a population, et cetera. And so digital kind of came on the scene in our industry quite late. So if we now go back 2,500 years to Hippocrates, all these little baubles along the way were, some really major advances, many of them technology that were pretty big dislocations that allowed us to understand the body better, do things differently. And they really created two industries that drove our sector, pharma and devices. And they kind of didn't change for a very long time. And while amazing stuff for society, they, all these collectively contributed to tripling lifespan in a very short time for our species. All of these baubles are analog, right? What does it mean to be analog? That means two things. One, the value from that technology, that, that test that Ken just talked about, or that pill that you just swallowed, can only be created in that very episodic point when it was, in your care pathway, whether that's at the diagnostic stage or at the treatment stage. And then secondly, that's kind of it. there's no other value that, you know, can be generated around what happened around that, unless you get, you know, academics to spend, I don't know, years studying data in a very analog way, and then writing a paper and then publishing it, and then 4 or 5 and sometimes 18 years later, we actually change models of care. And that's just not going to work when, you know, demand is far, far exceeding our ability to keep delivering in this extremely analog, capital and labor intensive way. Digital came on the scene 10 years ago in our sector, and I would add another 10-year tax to Canada, maybe even 15 years. We are very much late in bringing, you know, the benefits of digital to our industrial era. So digital does 2 things. It goes back and it makes a software layer that underpins every one of these analog tools. And more importantly, it gives us a whole new set of tools going forward that will be the new industries of healthcare, that will not be life sciences. I'm just going to tell you right now, they will all be digital that might have some physical components. And that is a kind of a reckoning for our industry. So what does that look like? I'll just give a couple examples. You know, one that everyone's talking about, that's an extremely asset intensive endeavor, that again, when it's analog, you can only scale linearly. So you just add another bed, add another doctor, which is just care delivery. We've had a very, very facility-centric, hospital-centric model. So, you know, these channels is Kaiser Permanente's different channels through which patients can access services, technologies, tools, and care. The northeast corner is your extremely labor and capital intensive. The bottom left below the purple line is, you know, not in the same place. So let's call that a digital channel. But really, you know, the future of healthcare, like every other industry, is no longer about multi-channel. Like you can either go to this hospital or you can, you know, go through an app. It's really omni-channel, just seamlessly kind of blending these whenever it makes sense for the current situation. And we've never really designed a healthcare system, you know, for this type of delivery model. We were constrained by time and place. And we believe the only thing that counts as good care is making patients come to some place to use technologies and access clinicians. So then you read, you know, I'm a former futurist, I guess I'm still a futurist, the headlines that, you know, hospitals will kind of go away. Does it mean they shut down? No, but they're going to be stripped down to something, you know, their original role, as Eric Topol in the bottom right here says, is basically going to be, you know, ER, OR, and ICU. Those high acuity things that you need, but kind of not much else. And we've already done this with psychiatry, as we know, despite demand going up, we don't put people in buildings anymore. And that's kind of coming to this kind of macro asset intensive area of hospitals. And this is, you know, Medicare in the US, which is 10 times the size of Canada's publicly funded health system. The lines have curved, right? They've crossed in terms of what the insurer will pay for. Is more and more moving out of asset intensive places. So let's talk about what that means for life sciences. Well, this was a great paper that kind of strategist Michael Porter wrote in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago, you know, that saying there's no more dumb products, right? And so here's like our metaphor of like, you know, you can't be John Deere and say you're in the tractor industry, because, you know, you're not manufacturing trucks anymore, just like Tesla is not a car manufacturer. That's what Ford and GM and everybody else have been for 100 years. They're a software app on wheels that sells car as a service, right? That's what our whole industry will be. So then, you know, some of you have technologies that you've made them smart. So maybe there's some digital aspect to it. So think of your bathroom scale, you know, and then the next step is for it to be connected. And so there's some Bluetooth or some connectivity so it can talk to other things. But where you create value as a manufacturer is taking it to the next level, and, you know, where you connect that smart, you previously done technology or product to a system with others like it, and then you take that system and you put it in a system of systems. And this is the job to be done of any innovator in healthcare now. Either you try to aggregate the whole system and it's anchored around your physical product, because that's where the core value is, that's where the science is, or you make sure you're embedded very intricately in this system of systems. And so John Deere is no longer in the tractor industry, they're in the farm automation industry. And lo and behold, a month ago, you know, Johnson & Johnson Medical Devices rebranded. right? Because, you know, being in the medical devices world isn't where the world is going. And I think it's very symbolic of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to tell you a story about how we do this at Teledoc. So Teledoc, you might not know a lot about them in Canada, but I got recruited 6 months ago to bring the platform to Canadian healthcare. Is the biggest company in the world that's enabling really care anywhere. And when I say care, that's not just a doctor seeing a patient, that's testing, that's therapy delivery, all of that. We're pretty global. We're 5,000 people. We have 50,000 of our own clinicians. And right now in the field, 900,000 humans are using our devices, our medical devices, as part of a digital therapy program, which I'll describe. And so the basic thesis of our company is, you know, 150 years of medicine built in-person models where, you know, you have to go to the lab to do the test, or you have to go to the pharmacy, or you have to go to the hospital. And we have to catch up really fast. If it's going to be a hybrid physical digital world, the assets have to be just as good, if not better, on the digital side. And we're kind of 150 years behind. And we've kind of leapfrogged that in 20 years as a company. And through about 17 acquisitions in the last 20 years, including our most recent one was actually a Montreal startup that we bought in October of 2021. We now are squarely in 3 areas, which we think is the future of all healthcare: mental health, complex chronic illness, and you know, routine primary care. So where we're going, and you know, why I came to the company is, you know, you imagine this is you or your family member or any patient, and at any point in time, there's baubles of different things they need to do to maintain their health. They could be in the purple in places to do that, or they could be accessing services, pills, devices, COVID tests. And, you know, we're kind of 2 things, the glue that can allow that to seamlessly connect instead of the patient having to stitch it together. And then for many of those little baubles in the orbit, we actually are driving or delivering that service ourselves in the areas we focus on. And so to do that, think of that farm automation, you know, we have to have the whole collection of the infrastructure. We've got clinicians, 50,000 of them. We've got our own technology, software, devices, and services to manage that technology. And then we run our own care programs ourselves. So we kind of, it's like, these are like our Lego blocks that we combine in different ways to help customers with whatever they need to do. And I'm just going to talk about 2 of the devices. So one are, you know, pretty big devices. These are our robots. They take many forms, and they really allow a clinician to get right in there and see what's going on with the patient. You know, this is not an AV Zoom solution for care without having to bring that patient to the hospital, to the ICU, et cetera, including at the bottom, our care kiosks we can put in a nursing center in a First Nations village, at a Shoppers Drug Mart, and attach all your typical peripherals to do your workup and completely avoid the ER, the OR, or the ICU. On the right is our deployment of these technologies in Saskatchewan, where a little baby who needs ICU does not need to come down to Saskatoon to get care. We do it completely remotely with our doctors running the robots from wherever they're sitting. It could be even at their house. So we do this now with 4,000 health systems around the world, millions and millions of patients every day. The one I'm most excited about is a company we bought in 2020 called Lavongo, which cracked the nut for mixing devices, software, behavioral psychology for comorbid chronic illness, because most people don't just have one. And we're not going to be able to give patients 6 different devices with 6 different apps and 6 different clinicians to talk to when they've got comorbid chronic illness, including comorbid mental health illness. And, you know, if we think we're going to make their care go down in that 0.1% of time they formally touch the healthcare system, those 4 visits they get a year, we've got another thing coming. The magic is in this big blue zone, and that's what we've tapped at Teledoc with the Lavongo platform. So we make our own devices. We manufacture a pretty intelligent blood glucose meter, blood pressure cuff, weight scale that's cellular connected. We can partner with others like the Dxtm continuous glucose meter. And our care model is basically, you know, to layer on these like 9 different parts of our building blocks. We've got devices that measure vitals anywhere you are. We've got behavioral psychology. We've got coaches. But if you need a clinician, you need a doctor or endocrinologist, we move up the ladder and we pull them in just when we need them, instead of the old way of medicine, which is having everything be done in a, you know, in a timeshare way with experts and buildings and beds. And we're now doing this for 900,000 people at scale. And when you've got a digital first model that still has a lot of physical, you can measure data in real time, you can deliver results in real time, and we can now deliver this to a health system and get paid for the result. And we now are at about a 3.4 to 1 ROI. And so you don't need to pay us for our technology until we give you the result. So that's the power of where this world is going. And I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Zayna. That was really fascinating. So a question, so I mean, I guess one of the standard questions just touched on it in the end, and maybe in Canada you could just, or maybe Ontario, you could just talk to, for funding, do our funding models for funding of healthcare, does it inhibit what you're doing? Does it need a fundamental change to support what you're doing?
Mixed,
You know.
yes. Some places it's perfectly set up because there are some health systems that want to buy the results. They're sick and tired of buying technology based on what a clinical trial said it would do. And then others still, we can't make it work with procurement. The good thing is Canada's our sandbox, and there's a lot of provinces and a lot of places that need a lot of help. So that's not the barrier, I'd say. The barrier is the inability to evolve care models. Right. We have a lot of preservatives in Canadian healthcare.
And just to add to that, someone's asking, how are you approaching you don't pay till we show you the result with decision makers?
Yeah, we're doing it. I mean, we've been doing this in the US for 10 years, so I can now bring those business models to Canada. And we've got quite a few discussions underway already.
Okay, yeah. Great. And somebody was asking about when you go to more in-home care, and I think this is what people think about. Can you talk a little bit, comments on the techno literacy of occupants at home, and also the competence potentially of caregivers going into the home? So the ability for people to use your devices, I guess training, those kinds of things, so that they are able to do a lot of what you're
I mean, look, COVID did accelerate people's literacy. We have to be really clear. I find in Canada, whenever we talk about this, everyone right away thinks about their one use case, and they think I'm saying it's 100% of the time, all the time. Everything is a segmentation. Right? Everything I just talked about, there's no chance in hell my own mother will do what I just talked about. And that's okay. Right? But if I'm her caregiver, guess what? This is the only way I'm going to care for her. It's the only way. I will not accept having to take a day off work, go drive, wait an hour in a waiting room, and get a 10-minute appointment that nobody's going to even remember what the hell we talked about in those 10 minutes. So it's about, that's that omni-channel. It's about choice and channel. But if we don't do this, our healthcare system will fully collapse. I'm just going to tell you right now, we cannot keep adding more and more beds in the old business model. And it's actually a terrible experience for patients most of the time.
Right. I mean, I will second that in the fact that my dad's not going to take an Uber, but I take them all the time. Like,
exactly.
So that kind of thing.
And guess what? 1 in 5 Canadians are going to be over 65 in about 5 years. And it is going to be you and me who are going to be taking care of this population. So really, this is for us. It's for me, it's for my family, and it's for the people I have to take care of.
Yeah. And so are you seeing, I'm just curious, basically you said Saskatchewan, and so that's really an interesting model there. And they obviously have, so does many places in Canada have these rural communities. Are you seeing a real uptake there as that you can, and kind of almost a validation of your model there that you can then bring back down into the more urban areas?
Yeah, but guess what? I prefer to go to northern Saskatchewan. You know what? There's no divas. They're not trying to hang on to power. They just want to do great care for patients, and they're really struggling with labor and access. And in our First Nations communities, you know, when a little child needs an ICU, they don't want to go to the white people's hospital in Saskatoon. There's a lot of trauma associated with that. So there's these other layers of value that we can bring that is very, you know, well beyond just access, right? So, and we're doing a lot more out there that we've shared recently at a conference. I'm happy to share offline.
Okay, and I'm going to ask one last question, and of course it's all about funding, obviously, because we're very excited. I personally very excited about the technology and the ability, especially as you said, to merge different things. So I don't have 6 devices doing 6 things. But someone's asking about how chronic care reimbursement would look like. Is it easier this way because you're bringing these things together? Do you think?
Much easier. So what we're hearing from customers in Canada is, let's say, your mom or dad had some issue and ended up in hospital for a few days for whatever, cancer or something else, Alzheimer's, but they already have these chronic diseases because most people do. Docs know the second they discharge you, you're not managing your diabetes well, you're not managing your hypertension well. And like, we're kind of trusting you're going to get taken care of in this pretty legacy model. So they can now put them on our therapy, our digital therapy, and be guaranteed they're going to do well, if not reverse the diseases, right? Like, yeah. So again, we have 900,000 people in the US with a fully paid business model. We're borrowing that to bring it to Canada, which I think is the power of a global company entering the Canadian market, because we're not learning for the first time with, our little crappy, toolkit. we're, all that learning's been done. We get to now bring it into the market, which is why I came to this company. I'll just do one last story. My PhD was in diabetes research. I left academia because I didn't think a single patient was ever going to be impacted by my work. I can potentially impact 10% of the Canadian population with this platform. I mean, come on. Yeah, this is why we do what we do in life sciences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree. So I want to thank you, Zayna. I would argue, and my personal, and I've known Zayna for a long time, that you're not a futurist, you're a realist, that this is the way things are going, and we can't keep saying this is what's going to happen in the future, because we won't get there.
It's here now.
Yep. There's my own commentary, because I'm moderating, I get to say that. Thank you very, very much to all the speakers, to David, to Ken, and to Zayna. I think it's really been fascinating. I apologize for those of you if we didn't capture all your questions. But it was absolutely great, and I enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I'm great to see what I consider to be something that's very, very vibrant. I just have a couple of housekeeping things that I want to tell you about. On May 10th, we will be running a breakfast series on new frontiers in food innovation. This is food like you've never had it described before. So here we're talking about cellular food. So I encourage you to come. It's here again. It's maybe not quite here, but it's coming. And so it's a really good, very interesting. These are Canadian companies, all Canadian companies that are doing some really fascinating work. So I encourage you to come. And then if some of you eat your breakfast between 12 and 1, we're doing another one at the end of May. And that's on lab space and opportunities in the real estate market, which, we heard about Ken and them expanding and able to expand where they are, but lots of people have had issues with manufacturing capacity. And so I think that will be an interesting one to talk about. I did want to tell you that we are actually sold out with our annual awards presentation. Slightly, want to make sure everybody's safe. And so we are sold out, but there is a wait list available. It is going to be a fantastic evening. And so if you're interested in being on the wait list, please call the LSO or email the LSO office and they can get you onto the wait list. I also just want to remind you that the Life Science Ontario Scholarship Program, this is a hugely successful program that gives scholarship to students to develop our talent in Ontario for Ontario companies. So please share this information with your networks. Applications are still open till May 31st, so there's still time. It's not an onerous application for people to fill out, so please share that with your network. And finally, as always, I would like to thank our corporate sponsors. I would like to thank all our members, but I would like to thank our corporate sponsors. On the screen, our platinum sponsors. Thank you very much. Our gold sponsors, and also our silver sponsors. We do really appreciate all the support to help LSO bring their programs. So having said that, I hope, thank you for coming today. Thank you again to the speakers. Please stay safe, stay dry today. It's going to be a wet day. And I look forward to talking to you and seeing you all when we talk about the new frontiers in food innovation. Thank you very much.